every time we talk about T1, how great they are, this is the best team in the world, this is the best team in the world, this team is so sick. There's always like these comments and these messages that are creeping up, like, yeah, but like, will they choke again at international events? And I'm like, all right, shut up. Like, look at this play, look at the eye test. Like,
hello, it is our first playoff episode of the Monte and Wolf Show for all you enthusiasts of Korean fellatio out there like us. Wolf got to cast the T1 versus KT game, which was surprisingly a banger. I got to be right in that both that T1 should not have picked KT and also that T1 was not going to perfect the brackets by not losing a game. So also Dplus inexplicably lost to Hanwha Life and didn't even make the double elimination part of the bracket. Lots of exciting things to discuss as we saw all of the teams play at least once, right, Wolf?
yeah, we did. Well, saying that we saw all of the teams play would be a little bit dishonest because I don't know if Dplus actually did play in that series against Hanwha Life, but Deft played. The rest of the team took bad fights away from their comps win conditions every game, and they lost. I guess we could go through the bracket like in order of all of our series and talk about them, and we'll spend more time on the ones that were actually interesting and less time on the ones that were not. Because before we talk about the KTT1 series, we have to talk about the KT Live Sandbox series, which was not good. But in the context of KT did not look very good in that series.
Sure.
And when KT beat Live Sandbox in that series, we were all watching going, oh, 100% T1 pick KT here. They look very bad. And their macro was terrible. Their decision-making on objectives was really bad. Like, KT looked very mechanically skilled, and they played the laning phase very well, and they won team fights. But when they were ahead, they didn't push their advantages very well. They didn't take Barons very quickly. They weren't actually getting objective control like they should to set up team fights for their comp's win conditions. It wasn't a close series, and it didn't feel like at any point KT was going to lose it, but it also didn't feel like KT were going to be very dominant. So I was like, all right, well, my prediction of T1 picking KT is definitely coming true. They're definitely going to pick them. And then they did. And it almost felt like KT was like faking it in this series. Like they were just like, oh, we didn't prep for this at all. We're going to win. It's easy. Because they looked pretty weak. And then they looked great against T1.
I will say, at least in the T1 series, that a lot of the mistakes about not playing to their win condition kind of showed up in game number 5, because this was an incredibly winnable series for KT Rolster by the time we had gotten to the 5th game. And then a lot of problems erupted. But before we get to that, let's talk briefly about Hanwha Life versus Dplus. This is perhaps it is definitely, I would say, the most shocking result. Every other result we would have expected given the teams that were involved. But Dplus, after really suffering at the hands of top teams at the end of the regular season, they kind of got exposed by showing what happens when you shut down Deft and leave Kana in isolation in the top lane. We got to see a series where Dplus, outside of Deft, when Deft was on the down and out and Viper was ahead, it was Hanwha Life just completely dominating. Kiin came back. I don't know why Kiin can only play in elimination situations. Really, it seems like if he can't get eliminated from a tournament, Kiin is terrible. If he can get eliminated from a tournament, Kiin can have some of the most amazing flank plays and rotations that you've ever seen, which is what we saw, especially on his Gragas. So It was clutch by Hanwha Life. Zeka really came alive in the last couple of games of the series on both Yone and Yasuo, champions that we've really not seen him play before. So it was even more surprising in that way.
Yeah, and it felt like Kana didn't look very good in this series. His Renekton looked good, as usual, and then Hanwha Life, all right, you can't play that anymore. And the most disappointing part about this series for me for Dplus was it felt like they were trying to play like T1 in that they would walk up to an objective and be like, oh, we have the right amount of damage for this. They think they can take it, but we actually are going to end up rotating fast with them, and we'll barely win like a 4v3 where like our fourth person is very late, but we actually will have the numbers advantage. And they just kept trickling into these team fights into a Tristana in the early game, which wants to fight early and then explode and get massively ahead. Or a Yasuo, when Zeko was playing the Yasuo, they're like, we'll just force this fight on the Rift Herald into a Yasuo who's insanely good at skirmishing in the early game, and then feed over kills to a Yasuo. The Yasuo has 5 kills at like 10 minutes. These types of plays, just decision making wise, made Dplus look super brain dead. Because when we were casting this, we were losing our minds. Like, these drafts are better for Dplus like every time. Basically, they have the better draft, they have better mid game, they have better scaling, they have winning lanes, they have prio, and then they can't get to these objectives fast enough, and then they just hard force like over and over and over again. It felt like this whole series was Dplus putting a square peg or trying to put a square peg into a round hole so much, and it was infuriating to watch because you know this team is better than this. We know this team has played better than this. And some of these players making the decisions, Canyon, for example, was often the one going in and making the decisions. Showmaker is flashing into these fights. These are players who have been through so many best of fives that, like, we were talking about their burnout because they've been through so many best of fives. They've been through so many high pressure situations, and they're just walking in like they're the rookies in this series.
Well, Wolf, don't worry about it, because now they won't be burned out because they won't be playing until June. So it's okay. They got themselves the rest. They entered themselves into a break. Didn't ever have to deal with the losers bracket of this tournament. Just in and out of the playoffs as fast as can be. Gave us a smidgen of hope towards the end of the split. And now they can take their well-deserved break until June. Maybe then we'll see them power up at Worlds, because we know this roster can be good. But I did see, as you point out, a lot of the same mistakes that we had seen over and over and over again, especially from Canyon and Showmaker. It was Showmaker dying in isolation. It was Canyon over forcing plays, getting ahead of his team, and then dying, and then giving up an objective or giving up a team fight that way. And so a lot of those same errors that have plagued Dplus throughout this year all showed up in this one series, and it was pretty ugly.
It was, and it's just very. It's weird because it's the first time since Damwon joined the LCK that they're not going to be top 4. So, I mean, that was going to happen eventually, obviously, but it does feel like we lost something in this playoffs in a way that if they had lost in a cool series where they played really well and Hanwha played really well, you'd be like, all right, that was a pretty cool matchup. You know, both of these teams, bit of a slow start to the season, but at least, now it's best of 5. Now we can see their true power. There's no more like, oh, they're getting new rosters. They're getting used to these rosters, etc. Like, I thought maybe in a series like this, we'd be able to push that away and go, all right, this is the best League of Legends these 10 players can play. And I feel like we didn't see that. And I feel like we got robbed of that by Dplus just denying it to us. And then you just get this series that doesn't even feel like a hype upset. It feels like Dplus just died with a whimper. And I would hate to be a Dplus fan right now because it just feels like you're like, but this isn't it. Like, and this is not even true indicative of where our skill was at our peak this season. It feels like a very strange circumstance, to say the least. But I mean, these players, I think, do need a rest. They deserve a rest, and they will get it, like you said. And, if they spend a lot of time during the offseason scrimming and training and getting better for summer, maybe we will see a better summer season. I don't think this roster needs, like, any roster changes. I don't think that we're going to see any, like, late summer pickups or anything like that for some of the free agents. There are a few. I think we're just going to see this team come back and run it back in summer, and hopefully things will look cleaner that time around, but just a pretty disappointing exit, honestly. I don't know what else to say. Like, there's nothing where we can be like, oh, but like Hanwha played a 6 series. They played okay. Like, Zeka didn't know how Yasuo worked, but he still crushed them. I don't know.
That was a funny interview afterwards where he didn't know that he had to like target the person who he wanted to actually ult.
He's like, you just press R, right, when they get knocked up and it gets the closest one, right?
Yeah. So many stories of pro players not actually knowing how champions interaction works, because how can anybody know how many of these interactions work within the game? Here at Last Free Nation, we are not only enthusiastic about Korean professional gamers, the best in the world, we are enthusiastic about Freeze Pipe, which offers you a cool and relaxing smoking experience. This, of course, is the glycerin chamber that comes off of the Bong XL from Freeze Pipe. You pop this into your freezer about an hour before you want to smoke, and then When you're finally ready, just hook it up to the base and you can cool the smoke by over 300 degrees Fahrenheit, making sure that you have an enjoyable time and that you're not burning the back of your throat, coughing up a lung for the next couple of days after enjoying your experience. So right now, you can head on over to www.thefreezepipe.com and pick up whatever you want, a Bong XL, their pipes, their bubblers, their dab rigs, whatever you like. And your entire order will get 10% off with the code LFN. Easy to remember because that's us, Last Free Nation. Again, supporting us does make a big difference with these sponsors. So if you're looking for a little treat before 420, which is coming up in a month, now would be a great time to order. Get your freeze pipe now. All right, so let's move on to the next round because this was definitely the much more interesting one. You were casting the KTT1 game. This turned into an absolute banger. And to set the stage for this, it's important to note that the last time these two teams faced, which was like about a month ago, it was a total stomp. It was the games where KT decided that they could play Lucian Nami and that, you know, they were trying to basically take away champions from T1, and T1 exposed them. We got to see like the Karma Sejuani Jax bans, which are really problematic for KT. And basically what it did was it forced KT to develop a new style of these pick compositions, which then we got to see in this series, and those were their most successful games.
Yeah, I thought that in a lot of ways, KT really showed that they have the mechanical skill in this roster and the experience in this roster to just get like a little bit down and dirty with T1 in these team fights. And I think a lot of the reasons why T1 lost some of these games and lost some of the control over the games that they had was because they were doing the T1 thing where they're like, no, we win this. It looks bad. And Faker's like, I'm dying. We're going to win this. And then like they rotate over and then T1 just lose the fight actually barely because KT matched them in terms of some mechanical plays. And then there was the game where they like basically inted on the top lane. I think it was game 2 where they like pushed into a Jax, and then Jax is just waiting there. Like Guma and Faker go in on Cassidy and Zeri, and then Jax is just like, I'm here. And then aiming hits like 1Q and the fight's over, and it's like, we lost control of the game. This is bad. Like we were winning really hard, and then we just hard forced into a choke point, into a Jax, and like Huni was losing his mind watching the games. He was on the desk that day, and he was like, "Why are we doing this? Why are we running into a Jax?" Like he was getting really mad.
To be fair, Kiin was already really far up in lane. Like that game 2, I think, was probably the most interesting game of the series because Gumayushi managed to get fed onto the Zeri early and bot, and then Kiin was like 1v1ing Zeus on the Gnar, like when he was on Jax versus the Gnar in top lane. So you really had these two carries powering up on either side of the map. And KT, I think, played really well around the Jax. And I think Kiin absolutely was the star player over this series for KT. He was really excellent. And I hate to say it, but this is another important playoff series where Zeus kind of didn't show up.
Yeah.
Not to the same degree that we've seen in some of these other matches. And he was really unable to handle Kiin's Jax. And Kiin is definitely, Kiin and Zeus are definitely a cut above the rest of the top laners in the LCK. They are clearly the two best tops. But even so, Kiin really did dominate in the majority of the games in this series. And Zeus wasn't able to hang with him. And it eventually forced the Jax ban to come out. And by game 5, that was the game where Kiin again was dominating in top lane. And it was only really KT's own mistakes that caused this series to end poorly for them.
Yeah. And you could see it on Zeus's face too. Like he looked pretty like by the end of the series on player cams, like he looked pretty embarrassed. Like he looked pretty like, oh no, I'm actually gonna lose the series for my team again. And like we talked about in the cast like his performance in the World's Finals and how it was pretty lackluster and actually cost them big. And it's been something that people have talked about for this player for a while. And while we can put him number 1 in our like all pro team and say, oh, okay, he's definitely the best top laner, like he's slightly better than Kiin. And I think that's pretty much unanimously what everybody agreed. I think even in the Korean votes when it came out, like I think Zeus was the only player in the role that had like unanimous vote. Like not even one person didn't put him first. And then you watch this series, and like everyone was saying, like, oh, it's a sick matchup between Kiin and Zeus. Unfortunately, though, for KT, like Zeus is slightly better. And so like your one really amazing strong point is KT is just countered by like you're the hitting the stronger point in
I
your
don't know,
role.
man. BDD and aiming have both been very good as well. So I
True,
didn't feel that way.
true. But I think that like I personally think that aiming is like a weaker version of all of the good late game AD carries in the LCK. In my opinion, like he's not bad and he will show up, but he's not like extremely dominant in his role. I thought BDD is super clutch, right? But for me, it was like, how does the top lane work? For the series is going to be super important. Like that was my thing I wanted to focus on, and my like storyline going into this was like, okay, Kiin's amazing, but Zeus is better. So is this actually a strong point for KT? And in this best of five, it was because Zeus didn't show up. He didn't actually play to his peak. And this is something. This is a discussion that we have to start having about Zeus in these best of fives because T1 and Zeus look extremely dominant in regular season games every time. And then the beginning of internationals, they look really dominant. We talk about how T1 should be winning these internationals, and then they choke and they don't win them. And like now you're choking even domestically against KT here. It's a potentially big problem going forward. Like if this team goes to MSI, which we expect, like will they win MSI? Now we start having to ask a little bit of a question about how will Zeus perform? Like, is he actually going to choke again? And it's weird because every time we talk about T1 how great they are, this is the best team in the world, this is the best team in the world, this team is so sick. There's always like these comments and these messages that are creeping up like, yeah, but like will they choke again at international events? And I'm like, all right, shut up. Like look at this play, look at the eye test. Like but then this happens again. And then like those guys who are like, I told you so. Like I'm like, well, I mean he kinda has a point, like it's happening again. Um so I am a little bit concerned. I don't think that T1 is not gonna win LCK. I still think they're gonna win LCK, but this series should be a bit of a wake up call, I think, for the roster in general.
Yeah, and I think too, what's interesting is that so many of T1's draft strategies have revolved around blind picking Gnar for Zeus and then him just hard winning that matchup, just dominating his lane, providing a ton of priority, sometimes getting solo kills on people. And we saw a lot of that Gnar again, and Kiin just kind of outplayed him. And I do think that part of this was I think it was a misread by T1 because Kiin is now 9-1 on Jax so far this year. I mean, he has been just super, super dominant on this champion. And so for them to leave it up, now we did see it as we discussed earlier, banned in the last series between these two teams. But I think the problem for T1 now is that they're dealing with a very different iteration of KT. And when I talk about these pick compositions, the dimension that they've added is one where they just have a lot of hard CC on absolutely everybody on this roster. And if you get caught out, one thing that KT is very good at is just chaining that hard CC. It's the Vial straight into a Counter-Strike, straight into a gold card, right? And then a Polymorph or something like that right afterwards. So there were times when Zeus would just die as Gnar in mega form before he could do anything in these team fights. He would just get hit by a gold card and then the chain CC would come in and he would just be dead.
Yeah, and
So
their
not
comps
all of it was
relied.
his fault, but yeah.
Yeah, and the comps relied on his front lining. And a lot of teams try to use Twisted Fate comps like this to try to pick a backline target because they can, of course, circumvent the front line and then flank. But in this series, BDD was just ready to kill Zeus every time. And BDD's Twisted Fate, like still undefeated, is kind of crazy. Like he's the only one who's playing this champion,
Yep.
and he's winning on it every time. And he's like pulling it out. And the 1-3-1 they're playing is amazing. The team fighting looks like unfair almost because they're so good at chaining the CC together. And every time I cast BD's Twisted Fate, I'm always like, I don't know, does this comp have enough damage? Like, I always have this feeling like, man, they just might not be able to win these late game fights because Twisted Fate doesn't do damage. He does some damage, right? But, like, he's not going to be doing the damage that a mid laner traditionally does, like a mage would do. And then he just sets up these fights so beautifully, and the ability to set up objectives with his ultimate where you can see exactly where all the enemy champions are is really huge, and it's been really successful for him. Now I'm just not going to doubt. Like I had doubts even in this series at the beginning, but then the second time you pull it out, I'm like, all right, I'm slowly starting to believe that he could just win with this no matter what if the team is all on the same page. The final game was really a tragedy though, because
It was actually
like
terrible.
it was like both teams
I won't
clearly
be so
were
I won't be so
not
harsh
playing their
on it. I
best.
actually think T1 played very well from behind.
Yeah.
But anyway, continue.
But then they threw a lot themselves as well, and we had like these crazy elder fights where Faker is going in and trying to kill somebody and dying, but then he gets a kill and then KT can't end and they have map control. So if T1 hadn't gotten those inhibitors the timing they did, which was a really smart decision, I think they probably don't win the game because they eventually just get teleported on and the base is open and they win and KT win. Also, having that extra minion pressure for those objectives meant that they could come over and set up for them and force those fights the way they did. But if they didn't have super minions going into this, I think KT win every single objective fight and actually win the game. And also, like the choke that we saw on the top side of the map where Zeus died and Kiin got 4 kills early on this Jace meant that the game probably should have been over. And I
It
still
should have
kind of
been
stand.
so over.
I kind of stand by the fact that I still think Kiin should have rushed Eclipse with the lead that he had. Like, I get it, you want to play Gore Drinker in this comp because of how the team fights work in a normal game state. But I think if you're ahead like that, you just rush extra lethality and you snowball even harder. Because when you get the early Gore Drinker as a Jace, it doesn't hit. Like, it's not actually that strong. Like, it's not bad, and you do have money and you are relevant, but you're not actually pounding. You're not actually like, oh, okay, like no one can play the game now. You guys can't walk up. You're just kind of lackluster, and it doesn't feel like you actually hit a big spike. So I think his build, while I think it makes sense, in the context of his lead, I think it really didn't, and he could have altered the build with the amount of gold injection he had. But he went for the Gore Drinker. Didn't actually end up snowballing the game as hard as they should have. It was a game 5 where like both teams were making mistakes, right? Both teams were playing in a extremely high pressure scenario. Luckily, it is double elimination, so neither team was going to be eliminated. I think I would argue T1 was under more pressure than KT because they were the massive favorites going into this series. And so I think there was a lot of pressure on these players for the first time in a long time in a best of 5, like since Worlds basically, where they're like, uh-oh, might lose this one. Like it might slip through our fingers. And like you said, they played well from behind, but that last game was not the showcasing of either of these teams' skill level that I would go. I'd go like, okay, let's look game 1, 2, 3, 4. Game 5 was crazy, but the other parts of this series I think were extremely high level and showed that KT is a team that's strong enough to fight T1 in the early game extremely well, and they will actually take those scrappy fights in the mid game and actually win them, which we haven't really seen except the time that Hanwha beat T1 earlier in the season.
I think for me, what was so tragic about that game 5 for KT is that they got this huge lead with what is effectively a poke composition. However, KT really hasn't been playing poke compositions this season, and they sure looked like they didn't know how to play a poke composition because they weren't setting up on objectives. And I think the real key to me was that they completely lost their minds when T1 started that Baron. They completely lost their minds. Like, first off, it was a huge gamble from T1, who knew that if they didn't do something, that they were going to lose that game. And it is a credit to T1. One thing that we've often said about them is that they know their enemies' win conditions extremely well. And they can make these reads and set these traps. And that's exactly what they did because the Baron was just a fake to get them to commit. Faker was on the flank and he just blows up Kiin with Gragas at the start of the fight, who had all the gold on him. Right. And because it's a poke comp, if you get the flank off on the poke comp, it doesn't really matter how far behind in gold you are because it's a glass cannon and you kill it and it's done. So for me, I look at some of these plays where T1 wasn't setting up. And in fact, I don't really understand some of these plays. Like, why did they feel the need to commit to this like 21-minute Baron that was half dead from T1? You can actually just let T1 have the Baron, corral them into the pit, and just shoot shock blasts at them forever until they're all dead, even if they get the Baron. If you actually just walk there and start using your Talia poke, using your Jace poke into the pit, you're just going to whittle them down. You can Talia wall them in there. There is no need to hard commit to this objective and to pull out these like really aggressive Talia ults, really aggressive teleports. You have time. And I think you can just frankly just let them have the Baron and it doesn't fucking matter. Right.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, like, by the end of this game too, when we're seeing this, like, you know, at the end was really just a macro tragedy, because what KT really needed was the Baron, and they couldn't let T1 have the Baron. So why are you worried about sending 2 people back to save an inhibitor when you could be poking at the Baron? Like, they have the 2 TPs, but the way that a poke composition works is you need people on the objective to
Yeah.
hit the poke. You
That was
can't save your fucking inhibitor, which, by the way, didn't matter. You could just lose the inhibitor, doesn't matter, right? And you need people at the objective poking. You can't just wait, clear out the miniways, then TP in, because if they're on the objective, you need time to whittle them down.
Yeah. That was the moment that really frustrated me the most, and I think Valdez and I kind of disagreed on what we thought they needed to do, because I thought 100% they contest Baron, because if you lose your inhibitor alone, it's not a problem, but if you lose your inhibitor and they have Baron, then you're probably going to lose the game. But with the wave states, if you go back to defend your inhibitor and they get Baron, you will lose the inhibitor anyways, because they will push it with Baron. Like you know what I mean? Like
Exactly. It doesn't matter. The inhibitor was up. It would take several minutes for super minions to get there. Just fucking play the Baron. You know what I mean? If they TP up there, you have 2 TPs. Just go back. Like, it was also, who is going to TP up there? A fucking Gnar? Who cares? Right?
Yeah. And if the call that Kiin made at the end of the game to try to TP to end, which like looked really cool and exciting for a second, I was like, wait, is he gonna end? No, like he can't end. Like, he doesn't have enough damage by himself, and they had to go through all the Nexus turrets, so it wasn't gonna happen. If KT were more coordinated and were willing to use their TPs like that, like with 2 people, maybe they can actually end. Like if BDD goes over there with him, they probably actually do have the damage, because he has an insane amount of AP at that point in time, and will just break the structure so quickly. And like they didn't coordinate that. I think they just panicked in a big way. And there's so many coachable and teachable moments in this game, I think, for KT. And I think the players are probably very well aware of the mistakes they made too. And you have a coaching staff watch the game with them and really break down the objectives, because there is no doubt in my mind that KT can go toe to toe with any team right now in the LCK in terms of their mechanics, in terms of their team fights. It's just the decision making leading up to those moments where we have to see some improvement, because it's the objective setup. It's when to do Baron, how to threaten Baron, what timings you should be looking to go for Baron, when you should be setting up vision on Baron. These are the things that KT have really struggled with. These are the things KT struggled with in massive winning leads against Live Sandbox. And that's the context we had at the beginning of the show, where I was like, okay, they didn't look good against Live Sandbox, and some of those problems showed up here in Game 5 against KT, where they had, or against T1 rather, where they had a massive lead, but didn't really know how to make sure they could end with it, and use their comp correctly, like you were saying in terms of the poke. So I'm really looking forward to seeing how KT plays out the rest of this playoffs, because on one hand, I want to say they seem to be the second best team in the LCK next to T1. But on the other hand, in terms of objective setup and decision making, I don't think I can say that. I feel like HLE has some edges on them, even GenG has some edges on them in terms of how they're setting up for objectives and winning games. And KT know how to play early mid, but finishing the game, that's sometimes a different story. So
okay, I will say that KT at least has learned quickly. As you talk about these teachable moments, like the last time we saw them get bopped, they came back and just fixed a bunch of their problems, dimensionalized their play, and then came up with a completely new style. I do think that this game 5, where they're running this poke composition, is easy to learn from what to do and what not to do. And I do think that a big credit has to go to Faker for realizing what his team's win condition was and then manifesting that into reality. I mean, for him to repeatedly kill Kiin at the start of these team fights with his flanks was extraordinary. Like, I don't want to take things away from T1, because coming back is very hard and you have to be able to make the play. Like, it was smart to start that Baron and set the trap. It was smart to get the flanks off on some of the other objectives and 100 to 0 him with the Gragas. Like, Faker played out of his mind in game 5. And
yeah,
that's why you have Faker, right? Because he is the clutch player. He is the playmaker. And I think when you like you're saying, I think KT can learn from this. I don't think there's a world where they lose to this iteration of Hanwha Life in the lower bracket. They have too many tricks up their sleeve. Like, they have too
Yeah.
many tricks at this point in time. They are actually a very diverse team when it comes to strategies, and I think they fell on their face here, which is embarrassing because they were basically dominating every lane in this game at the start, had a massive gold lead, and I mean, T1 looked really desperate, and T1 was trying to force all kinds of crazy plays because they knew how far behind they were.
Yeah. And I thought the series was fantastic from a spectator's perspective, like as a commentator's perspective, and for the fans watching, it was really cool because the like in Lol Park you have like a T1 side and a KT roster side basically, right, in terms of where the tickets go and stuff like that. Um and because it's a T1 series, and especially because it's a T1 playoff series, like the T1 fans are all sitting on the KT side as well. Like it's like mostly T1 fans in there. But it felt like, interestingly, even though there were still a lot of KT roster fans, that they were the minority in Lowell Park. But I have never seen KT fans like this since I joined the LCK. Like I've commentated KT roster in StarCraft 2. I've watched them in Brood War. I've seen like the KT fans when KT was like a strong team, even in the early days of OGN and stuff. And like to hear the KT fans losing their minds and cheering, and to have the studio feel like mostly silent but yet extremely loud. When you have like a small minority of fans like the KT roster fans in the studio and they're all screaming and cheering and going crazy when KT is winning, the silence that you can hear from the T1 fans in those moments makes the KT fans sound louder in a weird way. And it was actually super fun to enjoy like a telecom war again in a best of 5 after so many years, and to have the KT fans just be super hyped and super like, you could tell in their cheers too, like the franticness of it. They're like, "Oh my god, we're gonna beat T1 today!" Like no one expected this is gonna happen.
Yeah, the fans were going crazy, especially in game 5 with the massive lead that KT had accumulated.
It was just kind of like a touching moment for me as someone who's commentated these teams in another game, like and obviously through the last 3 years of LCK, but it has been a very one-sided affair between these two teams where it hasn't really been the interesting matchup that it was historically. To have the fans be able to have that moment, it was really cool. It was a series that like I think I'll probably never forget because it was just so intense and everything lined up and everything was epic and the fans were hyped, and um we had the new like game 5 draft music that we put together for this season for playoffs. And like when we were told that we had that music before the season started, I was like, cool, but like we probably won't see it because we never go to game 5 in playoffs. Like that doesn't happen. All of our
I'll
games
have
are
to listen
one-sided.
to it. I wasn't paying attention.
But it was just one of those cool things where the unexpected really hit, and it made the playoffs interesting because before this, it felt like to me, and I know you disagreed with me, but I felt like T1 was just going to walk through this playoffs and it was going to be a freebie. And already in that first series, like they hit a huge roadblock, and that creates an exciting kind of dramatic playoff storyline for the rest of our playoffs that I'm really looking forward to. And I hope KT continues to perform, and maybe we can get the rematch in the finals, because that would be super sick. It would be epic. And right now, no one has pushed KT or T1 to the brink in a best of 5 like this domestically, except Gen.G when Gen.G owned the meta in summer. So I'm hyped right now, and not like excited for KT. I'm just excited for the playoffs.
Well, what do you think about T1? Because it felt like Zeus and Owner in particular were really struggling in the series compared to what we had seen in earlier, like, regular season matches. And that wasn't true in the first game because the first game really was, kind of a T1 showcase. We got to see the early aggression, the bot dives in particular that have made them a force to be reckoned with. But once T1 started to get better control of the map and Kiin started really rolling in the top side, and BDD was on the Twisted Fate and he was able to affect the side lanes, it felt like Owner and Zeus really struggled in some of these games.
I think that a lot of this is due to the fact that T1, and we've talked about this a lot on this show, have been so bot side focused this tournament because that's been the meta. And we've seen a lot of bot focus from Faker where he's roaming down, they're setting up dives, and they're just crushing repeatedly the enemy lane and zoning them out of farm and playing extremely well around, getting advantages there. it hasn't really been through Zeus. They've been winning these games. And then KT was really heavily prioritizing Rift Heralds and topside fights in this series. And I think T1 looked a little bit lost in those. And when Owner and Zeus usually play, like when you see, because Owner doesn't like just leave Zeus on an island. He does play around topside a significant amount, but that hasn't really been the focus for T1. But usually, Xayah is just hard gapping the lane opponent where they can set up the lane and set up the wave in a way where it's really easy to gank and Owner can come over and hide in the brush or just straight up walk up the lane and then get a gank off because he has enough vision because the wave is pushed and there's no wards because the enemy laner can't get wards up, stuff like that. Zeus kind of has always been default winning the lane, and then when Owner wants to play around topside, he's not challenged. I think in this series it felt very much like, Cousin and Kiin were winning, they were controlling the lane, and then when they had to go up topside to play around that, when like Varus is the enemy laner and you don't have control bottom, and then you think the Gnar is just going to be a default win for Zeus because it normally is, and they pull out the Jace, and actually you don't have control of that lane. T1 seemed a little bit lost because their normal MO and their normal plan isn't really working, and it isn't happening the way they want to. And then like we saw the Galio game for Faker where it felt like they were like, oh, this is our comfort zone. We're gonna actually play this roaming mid and match the Twisted Fate, and we're gonna force these fights because we're T1. And then KT just outplayed them and were faster to the punch. T1 just felt like they were playing their normal game, and KT was prepared for that, and they individually played so well that T1 looked a little bit off kilter. And I personally feel like T1 picked KT because they looked weak in that Live Sandbox series. And they showed up thinking, this is going to be easy. And the preparation, I think, was way better for KT.
Could be that they already lost to Hanwha, too. I mean, I still don't think you picked KT there. I think they were just, especially after you see Hanwha beating Dplus, like you feel like the danger has passed at that point in time and you'll be able to easily handle Hanwha. I think that was definitely an error. And I also think that just you can't give Kiin Jax. I don't want to see that again in any kind of rematch scenario. They really have to, T1 really has to either have a better plan besides blind pick Gnar, leave Jax up. Because that seemed to be, at least in draft, the biggest issue that T1 faced.
Yeah, I just think T1 didn't prepare as well as KT did. And they were almost just like, oh, just do what we normally do and we'll win. It did feel like that was kind of the plan. And it's been winning for them all season. And then also in these games, like sometimes when T1 was behind, they were fighting and forcing fights as if they were ahead like they normally are. Like, okay, normally at like 15 minutes we're 5,000 gold up at least. So like, let's just force this fight. But actually you're 2,000 gold down and you can't win that fight and you don't have the items. Stuff like that. So I think it was uncharacteristically weak performance from T1 in some regards. But I don't want to take anything away from KT. I thought they played very well. But they kind of got into T1's head and understood the like T1 mechanisms and played very well around it. I think the Twisted Fate is a huge threat that T1 will have to consider if they rematch as well. So I think, to your question about Zeus and Owner, I think that, we talked about the topside stuff, but Zeus kind of choked a little bit. Like, he didn't play very well, and he didn't respect the CC when he was playing Gnar. He's just like, I'm Gnar, I go in, doesn't matter if they're playing a comp that has a lot of chain CC, I'm just going to go in and force these fights, and he died a lot. And I think he's going to have to reflect on that a little bit. Or maybe look for a different flank angle, because he also often just ran in at the front and was like, I'm Gnar, I've got my Gnar bar, I'm going to buffer this crunch into a huge push into the wall. And he was just caught, like, as he was trying to do that oftentimes, because he wasn't setting up flanks. Which is hard, like, if you're playing against a Twisted Fate and you're trying to flank, if BDD just ults, he's like, oh, you're over there, and then he ults on top of you, and then you don't even have your team with you, and then you just die. So it's like not as simple as just flank, bro. Like, don't just walk in. It's pretty hard because you can also die trying to do that. But I'm not saying this is his fault in this series, but some aspects of it were, and he's gonna have to tighten it up.
I also want to bring up just a different point about Gumayusi, and something that might be troubling. But the last 4 teams in the playoffs have 80 carries and Aiming, Viper, and Pays, who are all extremely good at Zeri. And Zeri seems to be really rapidly rising up the priority list. And people will find this comment weird because Gumayusi and Kiria actually did with Zeri Ash like dominate the early game in game 2, which is a game that KT won. And a lot of the issues were not that Gumayusi was playing Zeri badly, but because a rapid fire cannon gold card would come out, catch Zeus, and then they would just 100-0 him with a lot of chain CC, like you were just talking about, Wolf. But I think, it was lucky that Gumayusi got so far ahead. And in fact, it was mistakes from KT, especially at level 1, that allowed them to really get control over that lane because Kiria was able to do a hell of a lot of damage. And then they were playing Varus Leona, which requires, BDD or Cuz to be down there to really activate and all in. So it was a big struggle. But my concern is that T1, both Gumayusi and T1 are not great about playing with Zeri as a team. Like, even with this big advantage, they weren't able to convert it into a win. Part of that was Kiin being insanely far ahead on the top side of the map. But Gumayusi, that was one of his big problems in summer. And I think they're basically just going to have to ban Zeri out for the entirety of the rest of the playoffs, no matter who they face. Because
I think
I
that's
think you,
realistic.
yeah, I think you just don't want to give, especially Pays and Delight have been the most um, aggressive Zeri pair in lane, especially because they tend to know exactly the minion count when they're going to hit 6 and all in as soon as Zeri like hits 6, like the minion that Zeri hits 6, or sometimes while a minion is dying before Zeri hits 6, and then they all start the all in, then Zeri hits 6 in the middle of the all in. It's been really impressive to watch that, but I just get concerned because it doesn't seem to be lining up with T1's style.
Yeah.
And if they can't convert games where the Zeri gets really, really far ahead, I don't think they have a lot of business playing the Zeri.
Sure. And I think in the Ash Zeri game, we spent a little bit of time talking about this, but Ash doesn't really offer you any peel for the Zeri, and that draft was kind of weird. And based on the lead, we weren't really that concerned about. We were like, well, it might not matter, but it did end up mattering a lot, and they did kind of like hard force in the top lane, and went through that choke point of the Jax, and that was a huge error. I think that this was a problem that we also saw in summer, where T1 had to face off against Gen.G, and like Gen.G understood all, like they're like, okay, well, we counter the Zeri Yuumi because we have the singed pick. We're also the best Zeri Yuumi lane in the LCK because we're the best.
Yep.
We have the best Yuumi player. And T1 really struggled in the summer finals because Gen.G just were better at this. And it seems like that hasn't really changed, even though Gen.G as a team has changed. Like, that hasn't changed for T1. They haven't been able to put Guma on this pick. And we mentioned on the cast, I think he'd only played it like 6 times this season before that, which is incredibly low when you consider how meta this pick has been. They've just avoided playing it and tried to play strong side against it and try to push it out and try to play Lucian or Caitlyn or Draven, which is fine. But now that those picks are less strong and you have to be willing to play the Zeri as they were, it needs to be better. It needs to be pristine, basically. Or yeah, like I agree with what you're saying. It does seem to be a bit of a hole. Not that Guma is a bad Zeri player, but compared to the Zeri players he is competing with, he is like
Yeah. And also,
in
it's just
comparison.
T1 doesn't play well with the Zeri as a team. I think that's the other issue. Is it's just it doesn't it having these short range skirmishers is very different than the way that they play around, like having Caitlyn or Ashe on these kind of champions where they can deal a lot of damage and create picks from a long, long way away. And I guess I was a bit surprised to see no Caitlyn in this series, considering that T1 has had immense success with it. She did have some, I would say, relatively small nerfs in 13.5, which is the patch that this is on, but it's been such a staple of T1's compositions, and the fact that Kiria and Gumayusi can both play it, that it is a bit shocking that we didn't see this come out.
Yeah, I was surprised by that too. I think a lot of Korean teams think they have the answer to Caitlyn, and we've seen some Jinx responses that have gone pretty well. So maybe that's the fear. Or maybe they think it's still really good, but they didn't want to show it here in this series. But I think at some point with how deep the series went, like you definitely could have shown it. I think it would have been very good in a lot of their compositions, but I was also pretty surprised by that. We didn't see the Draven either really coming through, and that was also been a huge staple for them. So it did feel kind of strange. And both Guma and Viper are playing the Xayah like it is the hot busted shit. Like this is like the broken champ in the late game, and it's pretty good, but I feel like it's being a little bit over prioritized by these players. Whereas the Zeri, the Varus, these picks seem to be actually way stronger right now. So we'll see what T1 does in the coming week, where they have some extra time to prepare for the next series.
I think maybe part of the concern from T1 is that if you play the Caitlyn, you're going to be really pushed up, and they spent a lot of this series banning Talia, and then having to deal with the Twisted Fate. But either of those champions, if you're trying to put a lot of pressure on as a Caitlyn, can cause you big problems if you get first roam off. So that could have been part of their thought process as well.
True. Yeah. Well, I guess let's talk about unless you have anything else you want to say about the T1 KT.
Let's talk about Gen.G, who actually looked like the best team out of all the teams.
You think they look at the best team out of all the teams?
Yeah, I did.
All right, tell me why. Because I don't agree, but I could see based on results like why you would feel that way. But I want to hear what you have to say before I.
So a lot of these games were just very textbook clean for Gen.G in terms of maintaining objective control, playing a very like slow, suffocating style, not taking too many risks. I think we see really the power. I mean, Pays looked incredible in this series overall. I think he was absolutely amazing. You know, I think the third game of this series, people will read too much into, because this was a classic example of team crushes first two games, then fucks around a little bit,
Yes.
tries to play support Pantheon and see what works out, you know, moves Doran over to the Jace. Meanwhile, basically they had been prioritizing early picking the Cassante throughout this series and just allowing Doran to play into whatever matchup it was against Kiin, and it was working extremely well for them. So it feels like they kind of went off script, and this is one of those moments where if you're really confident you're going to win this best of five, even if you lose this game, that you want to start doing things that instill doubt into your future opponents, and maybe if you can win with the Pantheon support. However, in this case, the Pantheon support plus the Ashe lane was just extremely terrible into Blitzcrank.
Yeah. It was. They also fell behind early, and it's not a good lane, because what Ashe is trying to do for you normally in lane in the early phase is be super oppressive. And whether it's support or AD carry, usually you want to get an early advantage. You have Halo Blades, you push super hard, you slow the enemy, you get some early trades at like level 1, level 2, level 3, where you push the lane in. And the Pantheon can like all in almost every Enchantress support very well when you have the Ashe there and can push through. But against Blitzcrank, there's like a limit to how far you can actually get an advantage in this lane, because you will just get grabbed and then knocked up, and then the damage is going to come through. And it's a Varus lane, so they can actually push back further against your Ashe, because they can outrange you. So if you don't have another AD support with the Ashe, or if the Ashe is the support for the AD, like if it's that type of Ashe lane, you could be very oppressive. But with the Pantheon, it didn't work. And it felt like they
also just had no damage because they built Everfrost Ari, and Doran was super far behind in lane.
I mean, you're behind in this game, like you can't do anything. But I liked how they tried to salvage the draft, because it looked like, okay, well, Pantheon could be a flex. It's probably going support, but we don't know. And then Gen.G, I think they were like, well, if we can get ahead, we can roam with the Pantheon mid, and he can ult through, and we have the Vi Ari, and we have really sick pick, because you charm, Vi ult, and then you stun with Pantheon. Like, the comp makes sense.
Arrow. You can great picks from the distance.
It makes sense,
but Pantheon ult. Yeah.
It makes sense, but like, it wasn't
but
good.
Also, let me tell you who hasn't been playing a lot of pick comps. It's Gen.G.
Yeah.
I mean, Gen.G, it's the same shit we saw from KT, where it's like, no, you guys aren't the poke comp team. That's T1. Like, T1 is the pick and poke comp team. You know, KT, you play like front to back 5v5 and pick comps. Then I look at this game and I'm like, Gen.G, you are not the pick comp team. You are the 1-3-1 split pushing / 5v5 team fighting Pays goes crazy on Aphelios and Zeri team. So why they were trying to play a pick composition was kind of confusing to me. So I don't really know what to make of that one. They did sort of play a pick composition in game number 2 of the series with the Lysandra and the Vi, and that worked pretty well.
It was
But
like
at
a
the same
dive comp, you know.
yeah. I mean, this is just like a hard pick composition because you actually just don't have damage, so you can't fight the 5v5, and it turned out to be just a complete train wreck.
The Lysandra game was the most impressive game for me, of all of them, because Chovy and Peanut were just like, we're gonna go kill everyone on the map all the time, and Zeka looks very bad at Veigar and anything that isn't a melee assassin, basically at this point. Or I mean, like his Ahri is okay.
His Gragas was really bad,
dude. His Gragas was like my solo queue Gragas, like the first time I played it, man. He like it did like 4,000 damage that game. Like he. I mean, that was like one of the most egregious individual performances of any player throughout the entire playoffs. Like there were games that Closer looked much better on in the first round against KT. That was like he was also getting caught nonstop because not only I feel like he obviously understands how Gragas works as a champion. Like don't get me wrong. Like I'm not trying to say he's pulling a Zeka like I don't know how Yasuo ult works moment, but he knows how the champion works. He knows what the champion is supposed to do, and he was trying to do it, but he was doing it like always wrong. Like he was sitting on like Raptors, like trying to be like, "We're ahead. I just set up the Gragas engage. That's what Gragas is do." I saw Faker do this once. I'm like, "No, you don't. You do that when you're like 4,000 gold up. You have minion waves and you have deep vision." He was just like standing on the edge of these fights, being like, "I'm ready to engage. I saw Faker do this one. I saw Faker do this one. Hold on, watch me, guys." Then they were just getting caught and dying at the beginning of team fights, doing absolutely nothing, missing casts, just. It was awful. And this is a huge hole that Hanwha has had towards the end of the season. I think they've been very exposed, and that when Zek is on Yasuo, Yone, Ahri, these aggressive assassin picks, looks great. If he's on Veigar, you're like, ooh, I don't know about that. Like when you see the lock-in, you're like, oh, it's one of those games where Zek is going to have to play a slow scaling champion where he's going to have to be very careful with his positioning, and will have to play a very subtle game where he has to look at the right timings and not just like walk in and go, because that's Zeka's playstyle. Looked very exposed because Chovy is always going to be the full package. Like he can play the mage, he will play the mage, he'll play it extremely well, he'll farm so well, he'll scale up, he'll team fight well with that money, he'll also play the dive, he'll also play the assassin. Like Chovy looked way better than Zeka in every regard in this series. Chovy's like, I can do anything and you can do one thing. So it's very easy to draft against a team like HLE when you know that they're going to have to play this way. And they're not even like drafting early flex picks for Zeka. Like Zeka, you would think Zeka would be great at like playing mid Renekton or mid Jace because of his playstyle, but he's not doing that. So you're not even like flexing that. What?
Or Cassante.
Or Cassante, yeah. Like you would think that Zeka would be good at that kind of stuff that Chovy is really good at in at least those champions, because they seem to fit like the archetype of champs he's good at. But they're not doing that. They're not putting Clit on like AP junglers and playing that game, so that aspect of the draft is not even a thing. So Hanwha looked way worse than Gen.G for sure. But I thought that Gen.G looked really good because Hanwha was bad. But I think that like Pays and Chovy really impressed me this series. I agree with you. I think the timings of the ults we're seeing from Pays and the way that Hanwha was just, or rather that Gen.G was going to feed Pays kills and get him fed and understand that he's the win condition and we're going to give the Zeri money and then the Zeri's going to do Zeri things. It's Pays. His positioning in team fights is amazing. But Pays also like was out in no man's land, almost dying and actually dying a few times this series like he has in the past. And I think he will get punished by a better team, and I think T1 and KT in particular will punish this team a lot better. I think the laning will be better. I think you will not be able to, as Doran, just be like, I win for free. Give me the Cassante. It means I win against Kiin. Like, that won't happen. That won't happen against Zeus. So, while they looked good, I think some of the things that they did worked very well because it's a good matchup into Hanwha Life. And I think that they will not have the ability to, like, just put Chovy on Lysandra and just walk around the map killing people like they're collecting taxes from lanes. I don't think that's going to happen.
There's also the factor that like whenever Chovy's been a very interesting LeBlanc player this season because he he's done so many different LeBlanc builds at this point in time. Like he's run Airy in certain matchups and like QMax Airy in certain matchups. In the Gragas lane, he was just fucking farming Zeka with first strike constantly. Of course we've seen Electrocute. Like he really tailors his LeBlanc playstyle and he dominates basically every LeBlanc lane that he plays. He just has such an insane knowledge of this champ, and he puts on more pressure through all of these different builds and playstyles than any other LeBlanc player in this league, or in the world, I would say, which is very, very interesting. So I think Chovy is unique in that aspect, and that the LeBlanc is kind of like a secret weapon for Gen.G in certain contexts,
Yeah.
because it his ability to shift his playstyle on this champion creates so many different advantages that you wouldn't normally see if you were doing the same LeBlanc build in every matchup. So I think that's actually been one of the biggest strengths for Gen.G.
And we see a lot of LeBlanc bans right now in the second phase, just basically across the board, especially against Gen.G and T1. Like, Faker's not really going to get to play as LeBlanc for the rest of playoffs, I don't think. Like, that's unless they really heavily prioritize it. But Chovy, you have to consider that the Cassante pick that they prioritize early, sometimes even in the first phase, could be for Doran to just play up top and be a tank and just look for engage later on. Or it could be a Chovy pick. The fact that Chovy can play anything extremely well and is playing like the best LeBlanc game and is playing the best Ari game and it looks to be the best Lissandra. I know Faker played some great Lissandra games very early in the season, but I think Chovy has definitely been the best. It just really makes Gen.G have this X factor in their drafts that you really have to think about. I felt like in the past, maybe Damwon was the team where you would really have to think about flex picks and things like this a lot. But now it's definitely Gen.G where of the teams remaining, I think they have the most interesting power dynamic in their drafts because in a weird way, that the style of Gen.G is Pays gets fed, Pays carries game. Like that's 90% of their games. But how they get Pays fed is like the really interesting part where in some ways they seem like a predictable team because Pays is going to play like hyper carry late game, but you don't know what Chovy's going to do, and you don't know what Peanut and Chovy together are going to do to win these fights to get Pays fed. And that's scary because there's just too many ways for Gen.G to play their style right now for you to go, okay, I see what they're doing. I'm going to block it. I think that probably you should start with banning Zeri against this team, but then beyond that, like there's just so many things that Pays can play well. He can play Jin extremely well. Like you don't even think about like Jin as a hyper carry, late game carry type champion where you can get the Jin fed and then he will pop off, but Pays will actually do that. So it is a very scary team right now. I would put them behind KT and T1 myself, though, but I do see some of the really cool things they've done, and they massively deserve respect. And they are like I'd say they're only slightly behind T1 and KT, but they're like multiple tiers above Hanwha. And I completely agree that was just them fucking around basically with the Pantheon game.
I just don't think we're gonna see the same draft mistakes that caused the last loss that Gen.G had to KT in that game 3, where they played very badly, and also they, picked the Akali. Then of course the Twisted Fate was picked, and they got themselves into a massive hole in the draft phase. Otherwise, I think it was a winnable series for Gen.G. That's why I think Gen.G will have learned from that moment. And at least right now, Gen.G makes the fewest macro mistakes. And also, we've seen now they're willing to first pick the Zeri because of their confidence in Pays. And Pays, we also have to remember this was Pays' first playoff series ever as a rookie. And he was, I would say, the MVP of this series.
Yeah, no
That's a
doubt.
big difference than Zeus. That's all I'm going to put out there.
When you watch Pays do interviews, it's kind of like a internal joke. Like it's almost like a meme within our casting crew. Whenever Pays gets POG and he gets interviewed, we're like, "Ooh, who's interviewing Pays today? Like it's gonna be a tough one," because he's one of those pro gamer types who's like, "I came here to play the game and win the game, and I don't want to do all the talking part." Like, and sometimes the interviewer will ask him like, "So yeah, you got a triple kill in the early game. What was it like in that moment? Like, what were the comms?" And he'll just be like, I'm sorry, what was the question? You know, like he's very much like a extremely game focused guy. Doesn't look like he ever gets nervous. Like, what do you feel about your upcoming matchups? He's like, we'll play well. I don't know. He's like, who's our next matchup? You know, he's that type of player. I don't think he's ever gonna get nervous. I don't think he's ever gonna get nervous in these types of series. I just don't see it. And like, on one hand, it makes because of his personality and his like almost serial killer type attitude towards playing the game and playing extremely well. It makes like being a rookie and winning and doing this well in best of fives seem less impactful in a way because it's, you know, he's just not a guy who gets nervous. So he gets to kind of skip that. But that's a terrifying thing because it means that he's going to do very well for the rest of these best of fives. And I think he hasn't peaked as a player. He's still like early in his development cycle, which means that there's so much more we are going to see from this player. Um, and it's just incredible that he has this much talent this early and can just slot into a Gen.G where he's replacing Ruler, and his playstyle is similar to Ruler, and he's playing like exactly like Ruler, and it's the completely different support as well. Like he's playing with Delight. It's just wild. Like the amount of kills he got, like he broke the record for rookie split kills as well this season. I think that he's a very special player, and I think that some of the errors that he had in the early parts of the season, like getting caught nonstop and stuff like that, is like why he didn't score highly in terms of All Pro. Like he ended up third, but he could end up being ultimately the best AD carry in playoffs. Like he could be when we're done with playoffs, all said and done. Even if Gen.G doesn't win LCK, like I think we might look back at playoffs and be like, well, he was the best AD carry in these best of fives. I think that's a reasonable thing that could happen.
Yeah, I mean, it's also that you know, Delight has also been extremely good for this team. I mean, he really popped off in the final game on Thresh as well. So it's been huge. I mean, I think it's been really, really good for Gen.G, and it's gone way better than we could have ever expected from losing Ruler and Lehans. Way better.
Yeah, and the beginning of the season, I think there were some like good signs for Pays, and there were some good signs for Gen.G, but I think a lot of people were super down on them early on. But now, you know, you look back and you're like, this team got top two. And because the LCK is so competitive this season, I think people have legit, and the format is kind of different and weird than what people are used to. I think people have legit forgotten that this team was actually number two in the LCK, and they look really clean in terms of all of the fundamentals, I think. And we're seeing this team make no errors. Like Dplus taking those terrible fights against Hanwha, lost them a best of five, right? T1 making some huge mistakes, Zeus having some problems, taking some poor fights, getting a Jace fed, for example, in that game five. Like some of these huge errors that we've seen from T1 that gave KT opportunities, that's like a weak point that we could maybe see exploited. Gen.G, besides the Pantheon game, which is whatever, look like they're not making any big mistakes. Like they're playing the closest to like flawless fundamental league out of any team. So, and they're executing on their game plan basically perfectly. They're hitting all their comps benchmarks. And that's the sign of a team that's extremely well prepared.
So here's my other argument. So even though Gen.G did lose, you know, 2-1 twice to KT Rolster this split, the thing about Gen.G is that when they've lost outside of their very first game of the split, which was versus T1 with their brand new roster and their rookie player against a roster that had maintained their synergy, right? Didn't change any players whatsoever. And yeah, it was a stomp. Like T1 did stomp Gen.G in their first match in week one. Every other Gen.G game, even though they did lose to the Guangdong Freaks, has been a 2-1 affair. Like their series are always close, even when they're losing, right? And you know, at least for me, that says a lot about Gen.G and just the solidness of their fundamentals. And sometimes they make the catastrophic draft errors that we have suggested. But this is not a team that goes down easily and usually plays extremely, extremely well. And all the other teams, except for T1, have gotten bopped at some point in time You know what I mean? Like Hanwha's definitely been bopped. KT's been bopped. Dplus has been bopped. Liv spent most of the last part of the season getting bopped. GenG is like unboppable. And to me, that makes them their consistency is what's going to grind them out wins in these best of fives.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm feeling too. Like the fundamentals that Gen.G has, like that's it sounds weird to say because of the amount of extremely talented and experienced players we have in our playoffs, but the fundamentals seem good on the team that has the rookie and the player who played for Bro for multiple seasons to light. And they have the top side of the map that looks clean. So I guess we should talk about our predictions for what's going to happen for the rest of the bracket, as obviously we will come back after that, leading into the losers finals next week. But do you see any world in which Gen.G upsets T1 in the winners finals there in round 3? Because I don't, but I
No.
like I think you're higher on Gen.G than me, so I was like maybe he's gonna say yes.
Here's the thing. Here's the thing. We all know that GenG really could have beaten T1 in the last time they played. If it hadn't been for GenG just inting into them at the end of that third game, there was a very real possibility that I would say a likelihood that GenG wins that series. But that also ignores the fact that T1 kind of threw game one and it could have been a 2-0 for T1. Point is, it was a very hard fought series. Seeing this iteration of T1 and how clean GenG was, I do think there's a world where GenG can actually take this. I do. I don't think it's likely. I still put it at like probably 65% T1. So I think T1 will go to the finals, but I think GenG takes a game or two here for sure.
Yeah, I think it's gonna be. I think it's pretty good. There'll be a pretty good chance that it's like a 3-1 or a 3-2 that T1 wins. And blue side is super strong for both of these teams, so side selection will matter. And I think it will be a very close series. I'm actually really looking forward to it. Now on the losers bracket, I see no world in which KT. Yeah, there is no world. I haven't officially sent it in because they usually ask me the day before. But like, it's the easiest 3-0 prediction I've ever made. Like, there's no world I think Hanwha even takes a game off of KT. And KT doesn't happy game either. Like of these teams, they don't go like, oh yeah, we're up 2-0, we'll play Pantheon. Like KT doesn't do that.
No, they just play compositions they don't know how to play and then lose with them. But I don't think they're doing it in game 5. So, I assume that's not happy gaming.
Sad gaming. So I think we're probably going to see KT versus Gen.G, which is really exciting because that matchup will be at the finals venue if it does happen, and it'll be like the day before the finals, and then the winner will face T1. Like if the bracket goes as we expect, and that's a matchup that all of us in the casting team have been hoping for. I think more than anything, I'd say like maybe Atlas was really hoping for Gen.G Dplus because that matchup has always been really cool in our playoffs historically. That didn't happen, obviously, but I think the matchup that we were all looking forward to the most was Gen.G versus KT because Gen.G seemed to be super clean fundamentally right now, but also KT beat them both times in regular season. So that matchup has like
and
a lot of
KT
history and storylines.
KT has beaten them with some like clever drafting. I think what's exciting is that these teams all have such different identities right now. Like, we're talking about, well, KT is just going to first pick Zeri on blue side, I guess, right? Like that's interesting. And now we have this color from KT with the Talia and the Twisted Fate and these roaming champions combined with aiming playing these like scaling 80 carries and Kiin's Jax being more ridiculously dominant than any other player's Jax within the LCK. So all the styles are very, very cool to watch right now. You talk about T1 and the Gragas mid, owners Lee Sin, these combinations, their bot lane dives, how dangerous they can be. And the clash of styles is fascinating to watch.
It really is. And I think that if it's a T1, we'll know more after watching T1 Gen.G obviously in round 3. But if that series is hype, like if T1 doesn't just stomp Gen.G, which I think you and I are expecting right now that it will not be a stomp. if T1 doesn't stop Gen.G, that means we get a good finals no matter what, probably, because you're either going to get the rematch of that, which was not a stomp and was exciting, or you're going to get T1 versus KT, which was also really cool, and there's a lot of storyline between these two teams. So that's also really cool and exciting. And it feels like for the first time in a while, I'm like, wow, we might have an interesting dynamic best of 5 in an LCK finals. Like, wait a
Honestly,
second, like that might are we gonna have a a finals? Wait a minute.
The best thing that can happen, Wolf. The best thing that can happen, Wolf, is Gen.G actually beats T1 and forces T1 into the losers bracket.
Oh, that is actually the sickest storyline.
That is actually the best thing, because then we'd be pretty much guaranteed a telecom war in the losers bracket, and then we would get the the T1 versus Gen.G final. To me, that would be the most exciting thing.
Or KT Gen.G, the series we've really been excited for. That's the final.
Exactly. That would be super, super shocking. That means we would not see T1 and MSI. But this next matchup between T1 and Gen.G is very consequential, because whoever wins is going to automatically go to MSI. So it's really meaningful.
I had a this is like an inside joke in the LCK casters, but I had a dream in probably like week 3 of the LCK, like super early in the season, when KT looked like totally like that they were not good at all. Like we were like, okay, this team is looking really bad, right? I had a dream that the finals was Gen.G KT, and like I told everyone about it, and it was just like everyone's like, yeah, okay, what did you watch before you went to bed? Like, why did you have this crazy dream? And I was like, no, it was sick finals. Went to game 5. We had this like weird dream, and then like it's become a running joke of the season, because we're like, okay, wait a minute, KT's looking really good. Like, is the dream real? Like, is Gen.G KT going to be the finals? Every possibility sounds great unless Hanwha goes like that. I'm like, no, that finals will not be good unless it's Hanwha T1, because I guess there's like some cool storylines there, because Hanwha's beaten T1, the only team has beaten them this season, and they played them very close in the second round robin. But I'm already hyped for the finals, and also the fact that we have losers bracket means we get the losers finals in the venue as well, so that's going to be really fun. It's going to be good, Monty. I feel like the LCK finals won't disappoint us again, will they? No, surely not. There won't be a disappointing 3-0. No.
I don't think I don't actually think that's possible with the teams that we have and the general skill level of the region. But yeah, should be very fun. I think that'll about do it for this week for the show. Any parting thoughts? We've previewed everything.
No, not really. I feel like we kind of hit everything. So hope you guys watch it. All of our matchups on the weekends, obviously from the rest of the tournament, going to be starting at 3 p.m., not 5 p.m. So earlier start time, because I still get messages from people being like, "Wait, I missed LCK. It was on early." We do early times for weekends, which is the remainder of our schedule. So make sure you know what time to show up so you don't miss first 2 games of the series.
Yeah, and it's only 2 best of 5s for the next couple of weeks. So we'll see KT versus Hanwha, and then also T1. Actually, T1 versus Gen.G is first, and then KT versus Hanwha is the next day on Saturday.
Yeah,
so
I will
Friday
be. Yeah, I can tell you guys, I will be casting the T1 Gen.G series.
Oh, lucky.
Yeah, and then I'll be casting both of the finals, but like the KT HLE series will be, I believe, Chronicler and Atlas. So
Excellent. Well, we'll look forward to you there. Thanks a lot for watching, guys. We'll see you next week to talk about the semifinals.